to the third session of the day, which is basically what we're doing is doing the context setting. So we're going to try and discuss the context in which EU-Asia relations is going to be examined, and therefore the session is titled as Conceptualizing and Contextualizing EU-Asia Relations in a Changing World. So what I'm going to take you through for the next few minutes is the context, is what we're going to discuss on the notion of multipolarity. If you see, that's the theme of the winter school itself. So we're going to debate a little bit and see what is this multipolarity? What does this concept of multipolarity and the term multipolar Asia entail? We'll also see, of course, EU-Asia in the context, multipolar EU-Asia relations in the context of multipolarity. The challenges and limitations, will give you a brief insight into the challenges and limitations to EU-Asia cooperation. Why is it so the way it is? And of course, we'll have also in-depth session, a session dedicated to understanding these challenges much better on day 5. And of course, we'll end the session with a few questions, few important questions that I think we need to debate and discuss. And these are questions that I'm going to open to each one of you and understand what do you think about these issues. All right, so that's how the flow of the session is going to be. So let's start with the context itself. I think this is our new reality, that the world indeed is transforming at a very, very fast pace. In fact, what we see is there's a lot of changes that we see happening, geopolitical, geoeconomical, geocultural, too many changes that we see. And today what we see is, so far, the countries, the powers that were drivers of globalization seem to be going at a loggerhead with each other. In fact, what we are witnessing across the world today is globalization, economic nationalism, issues of protectionism, and this was something that was, let's say, became much more stark with the pandemic. If you saw the way nation states, countries responded during the pandemic, shutting down their borders, cutting off supply chains. So the interdependency that the entire world was, let's say, focusing on, was believing in, almost came to a halt in that sense. And a lot of other changes, of course. All this also led to the entire flow of people, the mobility that is also a very important characteristic of this globalized world that we are currently living in, has been affected by anti-immigration sentiments. We saw anti-immigration protests happening across countries, turning more and more, let's say, anti-immigrant. So these were also some developments that we saw across the world, not only in the West, but also in the East. And of course, what we see, technology, which we know, and we strongly, I think, political leaders across the world believe technology, which is the future of human society. We also saw the way technology has been increasingly weaponized with cybersecurity threats, with threats to artificial intelligence, the space war. So too many things happening, and these, let's say, geopolitical transformation, what we see is also seen in the forms of fracturing of power among multiple axes, in the sense that now USA does not remain the hegemonic power, which was something that was characteristic of the, let's say, the post-Cold War era, is no longer the reality. Today we have power, that's global power, being diffused among multiple axes in what we would look at divided amongst Washington for sure. Yes, USA is not the hegemonic power, but yes, it maintains, it's still an important hegemonic power in the global order. There's of course the rise of China. Let's not forget, I think you've already heard enough and more from the first session, how we discussed the rise of China, something that cannot be ignored. That's already there at our doorstep. Of course, India also has a very crucial role to play in this geopolitical transition of power that we see. Not to mention Moscow as well. Russia is also a very important power, and of course, one more element, one more actor that I would like to add to the table is Brussels. I strongly believe that EU is not any longer a power that countries across the world can neglect or ignore, for that matter. All right, and we'll see how and why as we proceed. So in this context, we see that the multipolar world has become our reality. But what does this multipolarity entail? I think it's also very important. We've been discussing, and this has become the, let's say, that this has almost entered all political discourse today. Wherever you go, I think on any forum, you will hear people, experts, scholars speaking about multipolarity, that we're headed towards a multipolar world. We're heading towards a multipolar Asia. So what does this multipolarity actually entail? Very common understanding of multipolarity, of course, is it's basically a geopolitical situation where you have, instead of one or two power, you have multiple power centers, which means that the entire global political power is distributed amongst multiple actors. But the idea is that all of these powers try to balance each other out. So which means that power is no longer concentrated in the hands of one actor. So I'm sure you're familiar with terms of unipolarity. Basically, when the power resides, it's concentrated in the hands of one actor. Bipolarity, when you saw during the Cold War, which was actually not a bipolar order, and I will, of course, take you through that discussion as well. So, and multipolarity, of course, entails when we have multiple actors who are now vying for power and power diffusion. But if you actually look at literature, there's also enough work within the field of international relations to understand the concept. And you have numerous theorists who have tried to understand polarity itself, the idea of polarity in international relations. And there seems to be some ambiguity, at least, on the origin of the concept of multipolarity. Some say that multipolarity is not really, I mean, if you see today, what we constantly hear is multipolarity is a 21st century reality, which is not really true. If you actually look at through the literature, some scholars have actually deemed multipolarity as a 17th century reality. Some see it as a 19th century reality. Some say it existed in the 20th century. And for some, multipolarity is only a 21st century, let's say. There's a lot of ambiguity on its actual origin. And however, multipolarity is a very important term itself. It's a descriptive and analytical term for us to understand how power actually is diffused among multiple actors in global political order. And many scholars also believe that this multipolarity is, at least it's considered by certain scholars, is that it's beneficial in the sense that it prevents the emergence of a global political structure, or a power structure in which there is domination. So multipolarity, as stated by some scholars, is always better in the sense that you don't have one hegemonic power. There cannot be hegemony because, well, you have the dominance itself is, distributed in that sense. So this is what some scholars look at it. If you actually go back to the history of polarity, and very closely observe what multipolarity has entailed in terms of historical looking at it, basically has always been, from my perspective, a story of rivalry between powers. And we've always had numerous isms, that kept these power distributed. So if you go back to the pre-industrial era, even that time, if you look at the notion of multipolarity during the pre-industrial era, it was always a rivalry over religion. So you had religion as the major ism that actually, kept countries apart. So at that time, the pre-industrial era in Europe was, of course, the rivalry between Christianity and Islam, for example. So there we've always had numerous isms that. Okay, hold on. Yeah. In the industrial era, if you see, there was a slight change, that from religion we now see this rivalry amongst nation states over material interest, over national interest, for resources, for military capacities. And the post-industrial era, something that we're familiar with, that's the era of the Cold War. We know that the rivalry was between ideologies. So it was the ism that actually that separated these powers was on ideological lines. So we know during the Cold War, the entire world, for that matter, the entire global political order was distributed in capitalist circles and in communist circles. But if you very closely look at the history, and this is another reinterpretation of the history itself, the Cold War was really not bipolar in the sense, because apart from capitalism and communism, we also had other ideological camp, which is, let's say, less discussed. It's less discussed in this particular context, and that's non-alignment, something that India was part of. India and many other countries, for that matter, were part of, and that was the non-alignment, which also not taking sides itself was also not taking sides, either capitalist or communism sides. If you actually see, it's also about taking sides. That's also an ideological position. So if you see, in that sense, the Cold War really was not bipolar, but could be deemed as multipolar, because you also had, apart from the countries divided on capitalism and communist lines, you also had non-alignment, which means that even the Cold War was, in that sense, characterized by multipolarity. And coming back, of course, every century, for that matter, you've always had some ism that kept these actors separate. If you see the 21st century multipolarity, and that's also become the defining, by some scholars, it's become the defining rhetoric, is the rivalry over USA and Asia, or USA and China, for that matter. This has something that has taken precedence in our political discourse. But what is different about this rivalry? The 21st century, that's also one reason why many scholars deem multipolarity as a 25th century, is because you need to understand what's different about the 21st century multipolarity, right? And the difference here in the 21st century multipolarity is that never have we ever had rival powers being so interdependent, right? If you see USA and China, though they seem to be at loggerheads, at completely almost at war with each other over different issues, vying for power, they still are interdependent of each other, in the sense, in terms of trade, in terms of normative. So there are a lot of factors that actually keeps them, specifically trade, that keeps them engaged, that keeps them dependent over each other. And that's what makes this multipolarity, or the 21st century multipolarity, a lot more different from the multipolarity of the previous centuries that we see, where we see that a rivalry of this nature, which had been disruptive. You see the implications of the US-China rivalry has had its implications on a lot of matters, for that matter. And if you again capture, and it's not just China, the rise of multipolar Asia is also, if you see, synonymous not with the rise of China, but there are also emerging economies. And that's what makes this entire 21st century multipolarity also different, is that it also produces structural geoeconomic shifts, in the sense that these geoeconomic shifts, in terms of difference in the trading power, in the economic power, will produce geopolitical consequence. And let's not forget that these structural shifts will also be followed time and again by economic shocks. So we've had the financial crisis of the 2008, which almost sent ripples across the world. European Union went on a Eurozone crisis. We had ripple effects of the financial crisis of 2008 on India as well, on other countries as well. We've had the energy crisis. I think this is also something that has gained political attention in the recent times. And not to forget, of course, the pandemic itself. The coronavirus pandemic has also had its influential it has had massive impact, in fact, over the economies of the world. In that sense, if you see, the idea of multipolarity is very fluid, in the sense that we also see very different kinds of multipolarity. In fact, if you have read one of the readings that I had shared by Amitav Acharya speaks of this different kinds of multipolarity. That's the strategic and the normative multipolarity. So what is this strategic multipolarity? Well, strategic multipolarity is something that we saw distinctly, especially followed in the West, where strategic multipolarity is defined when power is defined by one's economic and military strength. And normative, well, of course, normative multipolarity, something that is characteristic of European Union, the kind of multipolarity that we see, multipolar issues that we see with the EU, it could be deemed as a normative multipolarity, where basically actors resort to the use of values, of rule of law, of principles, of soft power. I think you also heard Mr. Rinaldi speak about how EU's ambitions to be a soft power. So these are different kinds of, multipolarity that we also see, and it's very important for us to understand that this multipolarity of the world also constitutes different kinds. In fact, USA within, you see the United States of Nations, you can see traces of a blend of both strategic and normative multipolarity, because the USA resolves to use both your economic strength, military might, hard power, and soft power combined. And also another thing that we need to understand, the very notion of multipolarity is also something that nation states have used according to their convenience, in the sense that the United States of America, especially if you see under the Trump administration, this particular narrative became very stark, was it rejected the idea of multipolarity. It's hard for the United States of America to accept the idea of multipolarity, because accepting the idea that the world has become multipolarity actually means accepting the fact that its power as a global hegemon is declining. So embracing the idea of multipolarity actually means accepting or coming to terms with the fact that their role in the global political order has declined. China, on the other hand, accepts or embraces the idea of multipolarity, and in fact is in favor of a multipolar world, especially at global level, because, well, for China, accepting this multipolarity in itself means that China has some weight, has political weight in the global political order. Whereas if you see, there are also difference in the Chinese position on multipolarity, where it wants at the global level the world to be multipolar, but when it comes to the regional level, when it comes to Asian level, it wants to be the sole dominating power, in the sense that it would prefer to have unipolarity at the Asian level. And if you actually see what the EU has to say with regards to multipolarity, a lot of member states, the EU and its member states, France, Germany, and Italy, these are some of the member states within the European Union who support the idea of multipolarity. And of course, I'll take you through this discussion. This is an important area of discussion, in this larger belt itself. But what's the major problem with all these different, ideas of multipolarity, whether countries accept, reject the idea of multipolarity? What's the problem with 21st century multipolarity? And it's in fact not a problem just of 21st century multipolarity. It's been a problem of a multipolar world ever since in the previous centuries. And the problem is stability. And this is something that I think we as students, as researchers of international relations have been boggled with. Can this multipolar world finally bring us or provide us with the peace and stability? Can we have more stability? Can we have more peace with the multipolar world? That's, let's say, $1 million question that needs to be answered. Can we have a much more balanced multipolar global order that actually ensures peace and stability? If you actually assess the current situation, the geopolitical situation, I mean, this is the question I would want you to, think over, and something that we can also take up during the, discussion, during the time when we have discussion as to, can we have stability? Are we heading towards any kind of stability? It looks like at least from my perspective, at the current time that we're in, stability seems like a hard way to get over, to reach to. And yes, of course, multipolarity, and advantage of multipolarity, only thing that many scholars would agree is that it captures the diffusion of power, but does not really make the world more stable. This is my own, let's say, interpretation, but of course, I'll be happy to hear from you as to what you think about this multipolar world and the relation between multipolarity and stability in the world. Okay, that brings us, of course, to two dominant powers, two rising powers that, well, of course, two actors that we cannot ignore in the world. It's very important for us to understand as to what kind of role in all this geopolitical churning that we see happening around us, what can these two immense regional powers do? Let's say EU and Asia, what kind of role will they play? And why does it matter? Why really does it matter? Why these two actors particularly matter to us and should matter to us is one, of course, you have to understand the size and significance of their economies, in the sense that these are massive. I mean, Asia itself contributes to about 60% of the global GDP. So there's a very significance, and together, of course, EU-Asia have a very important in the terms of contribution to the global trade, they have a significant contribution. And one needs to also understand EU's interest in Asia. If you actually go back historically, if you look, primarily EU's engagement with Asia, with the Asian continent, has been driven by economic interest, in the sense, and that's in one sense also becomes a limitation of the European Union, that it relegated itself only, at least initially and primarily, kept its interest in Asia only from an economic lens, and did not actually engage with Asia on a more comprehensive way. But of course, that has changed. The time, of course, that was speaking about the 1990s, when the very first engagement, first kind of engagement, real heated engagement between EU and Asia began, with the strategy on Asia brought into place in the 1990s after the Maastricht Treaty. And again, primarily EU focused on Asia, on different countries within Asia from very economic perspectives, and quite ignoring the political way. Of course, a lot of that has changed in the times to come. And both of them have common interest today, in the sense that both of them need to secure trade routes. And this is where the Indo-Pacific as a region becomes such an important development in the world, in the sense that if you actually look at EU's 90% of its trade actually passes through the Indo-Pacific corridor, which means that no longer can the EU ignore security-related matters in the Indo-Pacific. And that's the reason why finally 2021 we have the EU strategy on Indo-Pacific. In fact, what's also interesting is until 2019, even though France was one of the earliest member states within the European Union to come up with its own strategy on the Indo-Pacific, France had embraced the Indo-Pacific early on. EU, for that matter, the European Union did not even acknowledge the use of the word Indo-Pacific until 2019. It has only changed since 2019, that in the very official rhetoric of the EU foreign policy discourse, that we saw the European Union embrace the idea of Indo-Pacific. And finally, of course, in 2021, we have the strategy on Indo-Pacific coming into place. So this is also given the turbulence, the Chinese activism that we see in Indo-Pacific, especially the military aggression that we see in the South China Sea, that EU can no longer ignore security interest in these matters. And that's also something that India also has a very significant interest in, securing these trade routes. And of course, both of them, EU and Asia, primarily want stability and economic growth. Of course, the EU has always had the desire, and this desire has become much more acute, the desire to be and not merely be an economic power. I mean, traditionally, if you see, Asia has always seen the European Union from a very economic lens, and the same thing, of course, you can see that reciprocating. Of course, EU has also seen Asia from a very economic lens. But of course, this has changed, considerably changed. Of course, today what we see, and I'm sure you also heard Mr. Rinaldi speak about this change, that there's a lot that's changing, that the EU now wants to be a more comprehensive actor, going beyond being just an economic giant in Asia. And there are two reasons to it. If you see, one, as to why this newfound interest we see, EU's newfound interest in Asia, is basically, you also have to consider that EU's own relations with United States of America has been disturbed, in the sense that in the last few years, especially with the Trump administration coming to power, and I think President Trump's very threat to actually withdraw its withdrawal United States of America from NATO was felt across ripple effects in the European Union foreign policy circles, where declining EU-USA relations actually meant that the EU needs to look for new partners, that it cannot forever rely on the United States of America. So the ruptures that we see in the transatlantic relations, EU's transatlantic relations, has also, in one sense, instilled or fueled the European Union to look towards the East, to look for different partners, to look for partners. And this is also, I mean, one, of course, another factor that has also, let's say, strained EU and America's relations is EU's own relations with China. And if you see, when it comes to China, so far, EU has had a very, very dicey position in the sense, and this is not something that you can blame the EU, because when it comes to foreign policy, one needs to understand the foreign policy institutional structure of the European Union. No decisions on foreign policy can be made in the European Union without consensus, which means that unless all the 27 member states agree at a particular issue, the EU cannot form its position. That's the structural limitation of the European Union, especially in the area of foreign policy, where it needs consensus to move forward. And that's what we see is one of the major problems in EU's relations with China, where there are certain member states, especially if you, that you must be aware of, Germany's position on China specifically, where it never wanted a very strained relation with China, given that China is a very important trading partner to Germany, and it has always been in Germany's interest to keep good, positive relations with China. And that has also, you can see, that has had its impact. That has not gone down well with America, and especially during the Trump administration. But President Trump was, of course, very upset with the EU's dilapidating position on China itself. That has also strained EU's relations with USA. And the second and a very important factor that's also very important is EU's own renewed geopolitical ambitions. Today, the EU that we see today is a very different EU from the and I was a little surprised when Mr. Rinaldi spoke about how EU and military, the debates on military dimensions, on having a stronger security and defense activeness is gaining ground and finally gaining acceptance, because 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, you couldn't speak to EU about military matters. You couldn't speak about security and defense. But today, the EU that you see is a different EU in that sense, and of course, this started with the very announcement that the president of the European Commission, as she took charge 2019, when she announced that what she intends to lead is a geopolitical commission, which means that the EU wants to be a political power in the world. And we need to see the EU's role in Asia also in this global context of the EU's ambitions, that the EU now has further ambitions, further political, deep-seated political ambitions through which it wants to approach Asia. So the EU will not remain in the sidelines of being called as a middle power, but it does want to engage and balance out USA and China in this new found regime. And this is also surprising in the sense that if you look at the popular narrative, the impressions that the world has had about the European Union, especially the 21st century EU, it's actually seen as a union in crisis and a power that's in decline. So Europe is a power in decline. This is, let's say, the most popular narrative of the 21st century. And there's a popular perception that people have had. And there's a fair share of blame that you can give the European Union. If you see 2008, ever since the start of the Eurozone crisis, the financial crisis actually hit, the European Union has been riddled in numerous crises. So we started with the Eurozone crisis. The EU also later instantly had to face a refugee crisis with numerous refugees from its neighbors flooding into the European Union. That actually fueled a refugee crisis. Not to mention, there were also domestic challenges in the sense that for the very first time, you had a very important member state of the European Union quitting. So we see Brexit has also had its fair share of problems and implications within the European Union, and because of which, if you see the image of the EU has that been one of a declining power. That's a union that's riddled with crisis. But like some scholars, I would argue on the contrary that the EU is not a declining power. It might be short on security powers. Yes, it lacks the military capacity. EU still doesn't have a very concrete security and defense policy. It doesn't have an army of its own. It has to rely on NATO. Given all that limitations, it still cannot be deemed as a declining power because EU is slowly emerging as a regulatory power. And this is something that is one needs to watch with extreme caution and requires a lot more deliberation. EU today controls, when it comes to standardization, as an economic giant, as an economic power, it, along with being an economic power, it also has, as the world's largest single market, the EU also has the power to set standards, to shape, to harmonize these regulations and standardization, which means that the EU is emerging as a regulatory power. This is a power that one cannot, sideline. And considering this, keeping all these discussions in mind, if you see EU-Asia relations in that sense have potential partnerships, there are a lot more things, there are common grounds, there are common areas that finally both these entities have arrived at a consensus. Today, EU and Asia are engaging incrementally on issues of climate change, on artificial intelligence, on cybersecurity, on terrorism, on sustainable development goals, on education, higher education, research, innovation. So there are a lot of thematic that finally you can see that EU and Asia are engaging each other with, but there are also serious limitations and challenges that seems to be hampering their cooperation or a deep-seated cooperation. So what are these challenges? One, of course, we need to look at the contextual factors. There are structural limitations of the EU as an actor in Asia. Again, as I was just referring, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to external relations, the EU has an institutional limitation in the sense that foreign policy matters can only be decided on consensus. So you can actually imagine 27 different countries having a similar position, having to have the similar, fair share of, decision. It's literally impossible. You cannot have 27 members. It's literally impossible. That's one of the major limitations that the EU faces when it comes to foreign policy, because member states, for all the reasons, have reserved this particular competency for the foreign policy competency to themselves. Of course, there are certain areas within the European Union foreign policy where the EU is able to act, but there are still major decisions. For example, a decision on, let's say, imposing sanctions. I think some of you in the morning session had this question about whether EU would in the future impose sanctions on China, given the dispute that's going on. I would say that's very hard, even to arrive, even for the EU to. It's one way it's impossible that the EU can unilaterally decide to impose sanctions. It's not possible because all 27 member states need to agree and be on consensus, be on board and say, yes, we are ready to impose sanctions on China. So unless that happens, the EU is unable to impose sanctions on China, or in fact, cannot have an official position on these matters unless all the 27 member states actually agree. So that has been one of the, let's say, major limitation with which EU faces deficit in terms of its own activeness in Asia. And that's also got to do with EU's own hybrid nation. When it comes to these activeness, when it comes to activeness in Asia, it's also marked by competition. Bilaterally, if you see, a lot of Asian countries engage with European member states very in a more continuous basis, in a more deeper way. For example, France and India have had very good, excellent relations with each other. Similarly, Germany and China, for example, have very good trade relations. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, at the EU level, we do not see a concrete stern position against China, despite EU having problems with China over its human rights issues and, you know, other concerns. It's military aggression in South China Sea. Despite having a lot of defenses, the EU is not able to adopt very hard positions because of this limited activeness. And traditionally, if you see in Asia, because of these, specifically given its EU structural limitation, it's also the reason why within Asia, the EU for a long time has been perceived as an actor that's very weak on political engagement, slow on commercial diplomacy, feeble on self-promotion, and completely almost absent as a security actor. And the EU has always been, of course, this is coming in from the Asian side. Most Asian countries, India along with it, have complained that the EU seems to be over-promising, but when it comes to delivering, it's very short. The reason being, again, as I told you, that's the structural limitation. It's the institutional nature of the European Union and foreign policy itself. And so far, we do not have a revised comprehensive EU strategy on Asia yet. I mean, of course, there was one that was introduced in the early 1990s. There was a revised EU strategy on Asia brought in 2004. We do have a strategic document on connectivity that was introduced in 2018. And of course, in 2021, we do have an Indo-Pacific strategy, but we do not have a comprehensive EU strategy, particularly on Asia. So that seems to be really missing. As a reason, there are other reasons, apart from, of course, given its own internal issues, internal limitations, structural limitation, there are also other, you know, external factors why EU has reached or has limited engagement with Asia so far. It's only now that Asia has you know, upped in the political agenda for the European Union. It's also because of its own preoccupation with its own neighbor. Russia has always been the major threat for the European Union, a threat, and that's a very symbiotic relationship that they have with each other. That's because that's how the EU's conception is related to EU's historical origins itself. Not to mention the Mediterranean, Balkans, the Middle East, which is basically the nearest neighbor to the European Union. And the EU is, and again, these are also regions where we've had political turmoil. These are also regions where stability has always been an issue, and because of which EU has always been preoccupied more with its neighbors than, you know, engage with Asia. Of course, the domestic situation in EU itself. So I spoke about the frequent crisis that the EU had to face with when the Eurozone crisis was hit. Immediately after the Eurozone crisis, we have the refugee crisis, and then you have Brexit, and then you have the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, apart from these external and these domestic issues that the EU has had, because of which, you know, there's been limited interaction with Asia, there's also conflicting interests over trade. And these interests when it comes to trade, though trade being the backbone of EU and Asia's relations, even to this day, it is definitely, I would say and agree that trade is the most important area of cooperation for the EU and Asian countries. But even on that, they've had numerous differences, which are material and normative in nature. When it comes to material interests, of course, I think Professor Neeta Inamdar also mentioned during the inaugural address that the concern that the EU seems to be having is about the increasing trade deficit. Today, of course, we're in a position where it seems that the EU seems to be having trade deficit with major Asian countries, specifically with China. The EU has had trade deficits hanging around with China, which has drawn significant concerns, raised concerns in the European Union. Similarly, there are also normative interests, which seems to be, of course, and this is, I think, something that we are very familiar. India has had experience, and that's the inclusion of something like human rights and labor standards, and today, of course, environmental standards being introduced in free trade agreements. The reason why free trade agreement between EU and India never really materialized. I mean, if you see discussions on a EU-India free trade agreement has been ongoing since 2007. 2007 was when they introduced, they of course brought in the negotiations in place. They were suspended in 2013 over differences and other political matters that confronted EU and India relations, and to be only renewed in 2020. So the discussion, in fact, was just renewed in 2020. In fact, the very first high table discussion on EU-India free trade agreement happened in 2021 May. So that's when we saw the reopening of the trade negotiations. And the reason being, of course, the frequent inclusion of normative concerns, normative issues like the human rights, labor standards being brought onto the free trade agreement table was something that was irritant for the Indian side, and something that both EU and India were not able to, of course, come across. And even now, of course, it's with the entire narrative over climate change, environmental standards are also brought into the environmental standards, and concerns are also increasingly embedded into these free trade agreements, which is going to be the next, let's say, heated discussion between EU and India on free trade agreement, because the EU now plans to introduce carbon border taxes and make it a part of all its free trade agreement. So you can see that these are also areas where EU and Asia seems to be going at loggerheads with each other. And it's basically because the tension is also because promotion of what EU regards. For EU, human rights, rule of law, labor, environmental standards, these are what the EU deems as universal values. And in contrast to that, what Asian governments actually look at this universalization of value as Western interference in the domestic affairs. And these tensions that we see between EU and Asia that has been ongoing for a long time, ever since their very first interaction, also reflects the differences in the worldviews of these two entities, or these two powers. For the EU, we need to understand the nature of this region itself. If you look at the very nature of the European Union, it is a postmodernist organization. It's a postmodernist organization where EU, within the European Union, the only classic case where state sovereignty has been delegated. So the member states have delegated. The EU's existence is because of the delegation for sovereignty by the member states. And we see that reflected in its foreign policy as well. In contrast, in Asia, state sovereignty is something that is non-negotiable, in the sense that state sovereignty is a primary political value that any Asian country, for that matter, attaches to. So any kind of delegation of sovereignty is impossible, and any kind of attempt to do so will be seen as, of course, interference by Asian countries. And such differences, so this is basically reflects the difference in the way they both EU and Asia look at the worldview, in terms of their worldviews towards the notions of sovereignty and international law, is actually what leads to differences when it comes to multilateralism as well. And again, here we see the notion of strategic and normative multipolarity playing out, where EU is in the belief of proposing a normative multipolar world order, whereas Asia sees it more like a strategic multipolar world order. So with that, now, of course, I bring to some questions that I think we need to discuss, we need to ask, and these are questions that I would like to open the floor for discussion here. What will a multipolar Asia? Of course, we've discussed so much about multipolar world. It's, of course, the discussion also skimmed on multipolar Asia. What does this multipolar Asia look like in the future? Will we be the ones following the existing rules of the road? Are we the ones who will we be the ones creating the new rules of the world? Will Asia settle down and claim the 21st century or otherwise? And how do you envision the future of a multipolar Asia? This is for us students, for scholars, of Asianness, and we need to understand, are we heading towards a Sinocentric Asia, a status quo Asia, a divided Asia, or an integrated Asia? And of course, it also matters. This is another primary question that I think we cannot, I did not touch upon ASEAN much because we have a dedicated session where we are going to see EU and ASEAN, the role. So that's also a question that I would like to leave for you to, of course, look at as what role do you think that regional organizations like the European Union and ASEAN, two, again, power poles that cannot be neglected, and what is the role? And this is again what is distinct about the 21st century multipolarity, that we never had regional organizations in the multipolar experience of the previous centuries. So what role do you envisage the EU and ASEAN playing in this multipolar world? All right, with that, let me conclude, and I now open the floor for discussions, questions, if you have any. I think I'll have to stop sharing my screen because otherwise I can't see you. Yes, I already see two hands raised, but I don't know which one, who raised their hand first, so I'll leave it to you to unmute. Whoever unmutes first gets to ask a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon. Okay, ma'am, first of all, I would actually like to say, I think Asia would be in the future divided into, I think, 2 or 3 blocks, more likely. The 2 block scenario is more likely because, ma'am, in the face of US-China great power rivalry playing out in the South China Sea essentially, and in the Indo-Pacific as it is presently happening.
Yeah. I can hear you now. Sorry, we lost your voice.
Okay.
Yeah, could you repeat?
Ma'am, I'll just repeat. Yes, surely. I'll repeat it. I would say that under the present dynamics which are unfolding in the region, I would think that the region would get divided into 2 blocks essentially. One which would be led by the USA, not essentially led, which would be formed around the USA, and one which would be led by China essentially. Because the thing is, China isn't rising in a vacuum essentially. Whenever China would try to rise and assert itself in the Asian region, it would face pushback as it is presently facing. We clearly see it throughout the Asian continent. Japan tying up with Britain, with UK, with the Australians as well, and we see the pushback through the Quad, through the formation of the evokers. So, ma'am, there would be, I think, Asia in the future has a fragmented. Would be fragmented and divided essentially. Countries would be forced to pick sides, though they won't essentially like to do that. But I think unless there can be some twist and some change in circumstances, this is how the future is more likely to be: divisions and fragmentation.
Interesting. So you're completely ruling out the possibility of a Sinocentric Asia. Sure.
Ma'am, Sinocentric notion. There are 6 reasons why I'm saying this. And the thing is actually what essentially drives China, the economic boom which occurred. Okay, we presently see a lot of banking crisis, financial crisis, shortage of resources, as well as internal troubles in China. No country can keep growing on for forever. Of course, there have been China experts who have predicted that China will go past the USA in this and this year. But the thing is, we need to understand that the United States, the superpower that it became eventually, it was over a period of time. Okay, of course, China's growth has been phenomenal, but every growth story has its end, of course. So we are presently seeing the slowdown of China. And the thing is, the present regime isn't even doing proper things to essentially have the growth of China in a proper way. And the thing is, the growth of China was shaped with proper engagement with the West. If the West disaligns from China, China would face consequences inevitably. And China and the thing is, China needs to also take one thing into consideration: the countries with which it is essentially in this conflict. India, it is one of China's largest trade partners. USA, one of China's largest trade partners. The same is with Australia and the European Union. So, ma'am, it would in any way come to harm China eventually if it continues on this assertion and trying to capture lands wherever it deems fit. A country which has land disputes with actually waiting countries and basically goes around salami slicing lands wherever it feels like. Of course, negotiations with that country would be very difficult. And the thing is, the present regime isn't a fit one for negotiation. Look what they did in Hong Kong, what they are doing, what they are trying to do in Taiwan. So, ma'am, and how they are behaving in the South China Sea. Such reckless conduct can't be negotiated with. For a negotiation to happen, both sides have to be prepared to essentially give. But at the present moment, this doesn't seem to happen, as far as I see. If of course there might be people who have a different view, I would like to actually know it and learn from it. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, well, obviously there are no right or wrong answers to the question that's been asked. And one thing that you rightly pointed out, that the future is definitely something that next 1-2 years is something that we'll have to watch out very carefully, because just a few days ago, I think I was reading a report on China, and apparently Chinese economy seems to be taking a big dig because given the COVID-19 situation hampering there in the country, most part of the year seems like China will be shut, which means that the economic might with which China has been posing itself is going to take a hit. So that seems like a possibility. It's a little hard to say anything right now, but definitely those are next few years. We need to watch out how China plays out. Next, Hitesh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the really good presentation. It gives a lot of insights, specifically at least to think about how we can think about European and Asian multipolar world. Coming to the four ideas what we have come up, we have on table right now, that what kind of Asia can we have? Divided Asia, and integrated Asia, or Sinocentric Asia, or a status quo. So I'm a bit of pessimistic in my approach, but I'm sure there could be a much more nuances that we can find. But looking, what makes me feel that we cannot have an integrated Asia, because there are questions that is it possible for colonial states like coming like the European states, which are the colonial states, to look out from the Oriental lens towards us to make a and also specifically when there is an internal critique in every part of Asia right now. For example, there's a huge anti-caste narrative going on, which is actually posing the threat to the idea of state in India right now. And then there is huge problems in China right now with Hong Kong and the kind of developments we see. And coming to Sinocentric Asia, I think well, that's not a possibility, because India is also uprising as a huge power, and then there are obviously, I don't know, like when we talk about Asia, obviously we talk about Russia as well. So I don't think so there's any possibility of having a Sinocentric Asia, and specifically with the kind of policies US have, and status quo is not possible, because I don't think so that we can ever remain on status quo. We always go ahead. There is no stagnation, specifically when we talk about international relations. There is always something that has to happen, and that's why I think there would be more divided Asia, and after that division we would be having more developments that could integrate Asia, like, and I might be like taking it as like we have seen in European Union that has happened, but obviously I might be wrong. So.
Ma'am, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. So interesting insights that you have. This question that you asked about the Orientalist view, which of course EU has always been critiqued with. I think to a certain degree, of course, we have moved slightly past that lens for sure. I mean, you cannot, well, at least especially when you have crucial integral interest at stake. currently. Especially, I mean, China has I think this was also similar to a question that Anand had posed earlier to Mr. Rinaldi, that China has made inroads into the European Union. It has reached, in fact, Italy was one of those countries that participated in the 17+ initiative. So you can see it's almost like a bit of a dire situation, you could say, that the EU seems to be in, which means that you will have to put your interest primary much before everything else. So that's going to be one, and we see that there has been a change. Even now, when I spoke about the differences in the normativity, for example, when we have differences, clash of normative values, definitely something that we have seen happen on the table, especially with the European Union and India on free trade agreements. But slowly we see that we are also moved past it. Finally, of course, with constant negotiations with India, EU had to remove human rights discussions. At least, of course, they had to resurface it in another manner, but at least it did, but it had to budge its position. So you can see that also we need to remember here that today the voice that Asia brings on the table is with a weight. There is a weightage attached to it. Unlike, I wouldn't say this would have been the same in the 1990s or early 2000s as well, right? When the EU and Asia were interacting. But today, when EU and Asia interact, there's also a certain weight with which Asia and Asian countries, for that matter, interact with the EU. So in that sense, I think it's not going to be that easy for the West to always get their way through. Okay, so that's one thing. And interesting that you brought about, I think it seems like majority of you are against the idea of a Sinocentric Asia at least, and seems like divided Asia is what we might or can expect. Yeah, Hitesh, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I would love to have, by the way, Sinocentric Asia, because I think that would be the only possibility where we can have a stable world. If we have a stable ideology or a stable, at least of one single idea on which we are channeling the whole economy and people. But the fact is that it's not going to happen is something what we have to, deal with. And this is the reality, because China is not a superpower. And yeah, India is a democracy.
But if you see our prior experience with unipolarity, when there was a brief period immediately after the Cold War, when we assumed that, there was a brief at least period where we were in a unipolar world with America as the hegemonic power. But things weren't very stable even back then, right? So stability was not associated with unipolarity as well. So even if China, let's say, becomes, let's say in the future, hypothetically, if we see China as the hegemonic power, which is possibility of it is little difficult, but let's say, hypothetically, let's imagine, I don't think we would still have stability, because there would still be powers vying against China. So unipolarity has also been never associated with any kind of stability. Right?
I think there cannot be a unipolarity, because already nation states are in such a state that they can actually challenge each other with the ideas, and specifically with the neoliberal ideas. I think, and specifically, this has been embedded in people, that we consider ourselves as a free individuals, and we make a choice by ourselves. So since this idea has been embedded in the human being, so there is no way that one can challenge by saying that there can be one idea. So that's another truth we have to deal with.
And then Gauri.
Am I audible?
Yes, Anand, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. So I think when we are talking about polarity, I think it's more important to understand that these all have, to a certain extent, and I may sound a bit wrong when I'm saying this, but it's essentially a clash of ideologies and a clash of egos to a certain extent. Because when we look at China's tremendous growth over the past 1 decade, okay, it only accelerated because Xi Jinping himself was at the reign. And Xi Jinping's, let's say, motto was to bring China at the forefront, be more aggressive when it comes to the world stage. A couple of decades ago, let's say around 2 to 3 decades ago, or 20 to 30 years ago, when the second most, or again, I'm sorry if I'm calling it second most, it shouldn't be so, but we had Deng Xiaoping as well. And Deng Xiaoping's philosophy, like even he was a political stalwart of China. But his philosophy at that point of time was, we will bide and we'll wait. And, in that, seemingly stagnant, like, that's how the Western world essentially perceived China back then. It was at that point of time when, China kept a mask or a facade of being a stagnating or a not so developing nation, that China actually started developing. So it all took place within the shadows. It all grew within the shadows. And now it's like, it's the time for them to shine. So coming back to whether China can dictate the international relations, yes, it will. For how long, it's uncertain. I think it can go up to from anywhere from this 1 year to the next 1 decade. It can take place. Again, we are no ones to really comment on how China can grow. We can only speculate. But when it comes to the idea of having a Sinocentric Asia, I personally believe that before we actually, address the issue of polarity, it's more important to address the conflicting ideologies that the various nations have within Asia. I mean, to a larger extent, I believe the Western world has already accepted and embraced democracy as a core fundamental principle. But within Asia itself, we have a lot of flavors or a lot of ideologies in that sense. We have got democracy, we have got authoritarianism, we have got communism in that sense, socialism. So we have got a lot of things. So I believe to that extent, yes, there are differences in opinion. There are reasons why blocks are being formed. There are obviously questions of internal stability and external political relations that may be forged. But for me personally, if I were to look at the situation right now, it's better that we first focus on domestic stability first. We ensure that our own people are kept happy. Like for example, in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia, in general, we see a pro-authoritarianism like state right now, wherein authoritarian attempts are being taken to silence or maybe crack down on their rights. So I think this is a perspective that I personally believe is influenced from Russia and China. And again, it all comes down to the mentality of people, how they want to look at it. Again, there's nothing wrong with the concepts of democracy. There's nothing wrong with the concept of communism. It's all about how we personally decide to go forward. So I think instead of China, shaping the power dynamics, I think it's we, the people, who in the end decide how we want to go ahead with the kind of relations we want to keep.
Thank you. That's a very interesting and very important point that's exactly what I was trying to say, that if you look at the history of polarity, it's always between some kind of ism, some kind of, ideological turf or something. So if you saw the 20th century multipolarity was what? It was about this distinction, this ideological war between communism and capitalism. And today, again, we see this resurfacing. In fact, one point that you brought out, which is true in the case of Asia, where we have different kind of political systems. There's so much diversity in terms of political systems within Asia. Something that's also changing in Europe as well, and I'm sure some of you are also observing the kind of transformations that Europe also, which calls itself as a liberal democracy, we see certain member states within the European Union also facing, well, of course, the rise of authoritarianism. This is the case of Hungary. Look at the case of Poland, where there seems to be some kind of, some kind of reversal, some kind of change that's also happening, which questions the very values that, let's say, the bloc itself, Europe itself, has been standing for. So interesting. Thank you. Gauri?
Hi, ma'am. So basically, if I want to talk about two things. So when we're talking about multipolar Asia, I heard a lot of my friends here talking about how integrated Asia is not a possibility, or maybe they're looking at a possibility of divided Asia. But considering the situation that we are in, given the limited resources in the world and the kind of population growth that we are seeing, can the world actually, or Asia as a continent, can we actually afford to be divided is one question that we all need to think about, because resources are very less and the population is large. I mean, if we see Asia, then 2 of the world's most populous countries are in Asia. So, and we are competing for resources. So a divided Asia is always a question mark, because we are dependent on each other. Like if we are to take in China and India's relationship, there are days when our armies are at loggerheads on the borders, and then there are days when we have to sit on a table and discuss about certain things, because that is how we are, because we are dependent on each other, and that is how the world is running these days. So that is one point that I wanted to make. The second being, I think a lot of role of technology is there here as to how the rules for the coming few decades in the century is going to be, because the ones who hold control over certain new technologies will seem to dominate the other countries, which probably will not have access to it. Like we heard from Mr. Rinaldi this morning. So AI being at the forefront of it. And I believe that India has this technological prowess, but which it needs to, of course, harvest properly so that we can avail the benefits of this particular time, when particularly there is a change in technology that we are actually seeing. So that way, yes, India does have an edge if we are to make the best out of it, if we are to make the good out of it. And of course, yes, in that perspective, again, we'll come to a place where we'll not have the polarity will again be an issue, because we'll again be at loggerheads about we know this and you don't have access to this kind of a resource and such kind of things. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Very two important points that you've brought to the table for discussion. In fact, very true that this has been the major. If you look at the nature of problem that today we are facing with, especially just take the example of the coronavirus pandemic, it's obvious that no country single-handedly can handle a problem or an issue of this sort. And that's the same thing with climate change, right? These are concerns that basically concern the entire world. And it's almost impossible that any nation, for that matter, can single-handedly handle, which means that, well, of course, it would mean that all these countries actually come together on the table and work together, which is possible, but there is, again, we go back to, in IR theories, we have our realist scholars who would say that cooperation is, well, it is possible, but it will always be followed, cooperation will always be followed by some kind of contestation. That's where, again, we bring to the idea of polarity itself. Power is something that's going to be always there, right? So that's one thing. The second thing that you spoke about technology, that's again a very valid point that you made. Yes, definitely the future of the world, the future of contestation for these countries is going to be who has the technology, and especially now that we speak about climate change. Well, the issues with climate change is, of course, going to be green technology, which means that now, again, the world is going to be divided amongst those who have technology and those who do not have, right? So the next, let's say, this is, again, what many IR scholars are also observing the world and saying that the next war amongst nations is going to be for technology. So thank you for bringing in that perspective as well. Yes, Abhishek, over to you.
Thank you, Priya. I think my question is on Russia, actually. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I was thinking in this whole thing of whether it will be divided or unipolar or sinocentric, I was thinking last week, the new German chancellor, the first person he made contact with was with the Russians. So I was thinking within EU also, there is a sense that whether to deal China directly or to deal via Russia, So what you have to say about it, like how they look at it. And other thing is that within EU also, because I could see within the Western Europe also, let's say Spain and Italy at least, they they want to deal directly with China, because if you look at investments and things like that, even with the resistance which Italians and Spanish are facing, but still they want these things happening. And then there is that European Union level where you have also said about human rights and all. So where do you see the role of Russia in it, like with this Asia-Europe connection and things like that?
All right. So I think going back to your question about Germany engaging with Russia, that's pretty obvious as to why Chancellor Scholz had to make this call to Russia, because Germany is dependent on Russia for its energy, for natural gas and energy. And the reason why Russia becomes and will continue, and again, this is why, again, within, even on Russia, the EU has very, the position on Russia is also similar to that of China, that it cannot, because both EU and Russia are interdependent on each other. While Russia also depends on the European Union for trade, for essential commodities, meanwhile, similarly, EU is also dependent on Russia for gas and energy. So there is this sense of interdependency that has actually made the EU to have any kind of strong, let's say, take a very strong position on Russia. Even now, I don't know what is going to be the outcome of the negotiations and discussion that's happening this week, because it's something that I think one needs to really look forward to, because we really don't want what happened in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, to happen again. And that is going to take the world to another, I don't know, another geopolitical turmoil altogether. So unless they are going to, well, they are successful in some ways to keep Russia at its bay, hats off if they manage to pull through at something that we'll have to watch. But again, that's one of the reasons why EU also has a very complicated relationship with Russia, because there are member states who are dependent, unlike Germany being a country with a political voice, a very important political voice in EU, and foreign policy matters for that matter. It's not possible that the EU takes a very hard, strong stand against Russia unless, as I said, all 27 member states agree. So that's the limitation of EU's foreign policy itself, and why it cannot have a strong stand either on Russia or China for that matter, because there's a solid, especially Germany has had, in fact, very interesting that you brought both China and Russia for that matter, because both of these countries have reason why EU is not able to have had a strong position, primarily because Germany is on the contrary side. So that's also something that has impacted. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rishabh.
Yes, can you hear me? Listening to the talk, I had a few questions that repeatedly came to my mind throughout the discussion of our semester. Because of the experience of that the larger the cooperation is, the more fragile it seems to be. Because I usually look at it in the sense that you're building things out of sandcastle, and after some times things are going to crumble down, and therefore, well, maybe I'm being a little more pessimistic, but it makes me question the nature of nation state itself. Is that is there a threshold as to how much cooperation a particular nations together can take, or the more the more cooperation it comes, the more fragile it becomes because of the differences that comes with it? And one of the reasons that cooperations usually are successful is because historically they might have gone through the same thing together. So, for example, even in India's case or EU's case, the states are together in India because we had the same freedom struggle together, or else we don't have much thing in common. And the same thing with EU, where they had Europe had to go through the two big wars together, and they are now together. And then because the post-Soviet countries, they also feel a camaraderie towards each other because of the shared history. Maybe the Sinocentric view of Asia is possible if the fragmented Asia is possible if our view towards China becomes very similar. So we might form, there might be a formation of one bloc that we already seeing right now, that is looking at China as something as the other, usually questioning the source. Okay, if I'm making a little more sense, in the sense that we are now able to question the source of whatever change, wherever the change is coming from. Usually when America had this vacuum of when the Soviet Union usually collapsed, we didn't have the power of information, first of all, that we have right now, and the influence over the people and the public in general when it comes to mass media. Right now, every individual is able to question the source where it's coming from, and generally mass media drives wherever the allegiance lies towards. So yeah, maybe the fragmentation of Asia is much more possibility than Sinocentric, because of how we are already questioning the change that China is bringing into this world.
That's definitely, if you see what's happening in Asia right now, it can be in one sense seen as fragmented, because you could see the kind of, especially when it comes to Indo-Pacific, we are seeing the emergence of different kinds of formations, political, alliance of formation that we're seeing today. Like, for example, the announcement of AUKUS, for example, the revival of Quad, for example. Those were in one sense a bit of a surprise, because you had powers that you never thought actually coming together, right? So I think this is something that's also boggling IR scholars, and that's what they're also trying to understand better, as to why certain states cooperate and come together. I mean, if you just take the case of AUKUS, for example, the AUKUS agreement that was announced, there is absolutely no proper rationale that most scholars could find as to why UK was even part of the deal, right? So that's something that has really, really boggled a lot of scholars as to what was UK's. I mean, it was a very, let's say, very strange combination of nation states coming together, USA, Australia, and then on the other hand, you have UK coming into the picture. So that was something that was, so you see, alliances formation that's happening today are happening, of course, rapidly. I mean, in the span of last 2 years, we saw the emergence of Quad, AUKUS, and all these regional groupings coming into existence. That is going to change, and that's why, in one sense, I would also agree that a Sino-centric Asia might be difficult to have into place. So that's, for now, of course, this is again left to discussion, interpretation as to what will happen in the future. Hitesh and then Anirban. Come back to Anirban.
Just one question about, like not exactly question, a comment about how, this EU carbon tax, what you have mentioned today in all free trade agreements, which has become a sort of regulatory, like I'm sure, and when we're talking about regulatory, we're talking about in Foucauldian terms of how it has become a discourse of amongst people, right? Then and it also brings the discussion of this whole intellectual property right to or specifically we bring this in COVID times, which have been really exploited by the West, and all thanks to the colonial and neo-colonial turmoil that the East has gone with zero reparations till now. But this whole deal of Quad, which you just mentioned right now, is actually makes sense in order it makes sense because since India wears its democracy very proudly, and we have a communist country just beside us, and still we might find that there might be not an ideological war in this case, because even China is not acting all communist to the whole in Marxist way. But that's the thing. Even the thing is, it does not have a democracy. It does not have something what West wants. It does not have the Western idea of civilization. So therefore, like they have to really be with someone. And Pakistan has never been a great ally, come out as a great asset for the West. And they have paid enough for it. So right now, India is the only option left. So I guess that's the only reason why we are having so much of alliances.
Yeah, the ideological difference certainly is a very important factor, important element that has brought China into the radar of world leaders, world actors for that matter. Rightly so. Yeah, Anirban?
So thanks a lot for the discussion. So my takeaway and my question was basically surrounded upon the issue-based cooperation between the two hemispheres, like for example, the West and the East. So just to take into that particular consideration as well, I think the discussion is mainly focused on the power politics and the great power politics, which is featuring in the Indo-Pacific region. So what my question is basically, will there be the cooperation on the basis of issues in the Indo-Pacific region before the countries ramp up to balance off China in this particular region? Because I think first of all, just to have the countries on board, it's best to have the trust for countering them. For example, in the case of the Southeast Asia, we can see many of the countries are not ready to choose between the two great powers, the United States and China. For example, in the case of Malaysia, I think they're not ready to choose between the two great powers, because in the case of in the case of China, for example, this can have an alliance with the West, or becoming too close with the Western countries will lead to a situation where it cannot delineate from, as well as create troubles for Malaysia in its own backyard. For example, it has its own dispute with China, which can flare up. So, will there be any issue-based cooperation between the Western powers, like the United States, to counter China?
Yes, in fact, issue-based cooperation is something that is, I think there are two ways that the Western powers are engaging with Asia to counter China, of course. One is, of course, the issue-based cooperation, and one is a very comprehensive cooperation. If you actually see the 24th September when Quad leaders met physically, and you saw that, I don't know if you had a chance, but do have a look at the document, the document that came out after the Quad summit. That you could see was a very comprehensive, that was again, Quad cooperation was on the Indo-Pacific, where it was cooperation amongst these four powers. And that was a very comprehensive cooperation agreement, because it dealt with it covered almost every length and breadth of issues that you could think of, from climate change, trade, research and innovation, science diplomacy. Every area, every sphere of cooperation was actually captured. So that was a very comprehensive, let's say, cooperation agreement, sort of, that was not an agreement, but an outcome of Quad itself. So what we see, and that's one kind of, issue, the comprehensive, let's say, cooperation that's taking place. And that's, again, very clear, it was to counter China in the Indo-Pacific, right? So this is one. Second is also, if you see, even EU on that matter is engaging with Asian powers on very issue-based, issue and comprehensive also. In fact, the example of the issue-based cooperation is, for example, the EU-India Connectivity Partnership signed last year, right? So EU and India are both now engaging on, or the maritime security engagement, for example, that was signed in 2019. So there are issue-based cooperations that we see. So we're seeing actually, and that's, I think that's something that's very distinct about international relations of the times that we're living today. It's that we're seeing an amalgamation of things. We're seeing cooperation happening in different forms, in different ways, at different levels. So you have, on the one hand, just like you mentioned, there's a comprehensive way of cooperation that's happening to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. Similarly, we also have very issue-based cooperation as well. I think these issue-based cooperation we will take up individually, and of course, keeping the Indo-Pacific at the backdrop, we will take up in different sessions of the winter school, right? I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Before I come to you, maybe I'll give the chance to Veronica, just saying, because you had a chance, so I'll just bring in more voices. Yeah, Veronica, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I just feel that I could sense like they are some sort of like allow me to use the word like anti-China sentiments. I feel for me personally, even though I am Chinese ethnic background with Malaysian nationality, and in my university, more than half of the students are from mainland China. Even Chinese language is my mother tongue. I myself having difficulty interacting with my Chinese nationalities classmates. I do aware that they perhaps are also like some challenge for us to interact with different nationalities. Same to Malaysians who have Indian Malaysians, same to us that when we interact with other ethnic background as well. So I would like to say that we have to know that we shouldn't categorize the whole nationality the same, one type only. No. There is one say that one race more than 100 types of personality. So does China. We have also need to be aware that the people whom, even the Chinese nationalities whom we interact, may not, they don't represent the whole Chinese nationality. So does Chinese government. For example, some of you are Indian nationalities, you may not agree with your own government as well. So do the Chinese nationalists. But based on my observation, for me, I think that the race of China is already unavoidable. Based on my observations, China is expected to take over the US as the world's #1 GDP power, not in less than 10 years, but in less than 5 years. Actually, I interact every day with Indians because I have website developers, graphic designers from India. So while we Malaysians are also afraid of interacting with Indians, right? Same, my team members, they are very hardworking. Because Malaysia have the mindset, have the perception that Indians very difficult to deal with. Very difficult. But for my team, my closest team members are from India. So I would like to say that we are in the international relations studies. For me, I would like to advocate for peace. So while we deal with some nationalities who are difficult, we also need to identify that they don't represent the whole nations. And then for me, I am a peace lover, so I would like that we continue to work for the collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. In fact, I think you made also a very important point that yes, China, I mean, overtaking USA is going to be less than 5 years, maybe, if of course we do not have any further economic, shocks or any other such political situations developing that hampers China's growth. But yes, that's definitely a possibility that one needs to consider, and it is true. I mean, I agree with you in that in the next span of few years, of course, China will take over the American GDP, because the difference is what, of $7 trillion? I think that's more or less I was just seeing that in the morning, was checking the newspapers today and realized that the difference is just over $7 trillion, which is not much, unless of course you have a pandemic-like thing happening, which sort of, puts a brake over economic growth as such. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. Anand?
I just hope I'm not overshooting the time.
No, tell me.
Yeah, so firstly, I'd like to agree with you on the point regarding AUKUS. Even when I first read about AUKUS, I initially thought of it as just another contract made between the United States and the Australia. I found it really bizarre that UK as well came into it. So as of now, I personally consider AUKUS as a very ambiguous grouping of nations. It just seems like a security pact between the United States and Australia. And for the sake of peace in the overall region and in overall politics, I like to consider it as just as a sort of a bilateral or a trilateral relationship between these nations. I don't really like to think more of it. Secondly, I think when we are talking about, and again, with respect to what Ms. Veronica already raised, I think we, or the world essentially, is trying to establish a more peaceful world. And I think with the hegemonic rise of, I'd say, the people who are currently in power in China, again, since Veronica ma'am already raised the important point of how people within China itself may not be on the same page with the government itself. And that's a common trend within India itself. Like, for example, I myself am critical of various government-led measures, and I'm pretty sure a lot of us are in that perspective. So I'd say that the moves that the Chinese government has been taking forward have been detrimental to both the interests of India from a border perspective and also to a lot of nations. Like, for example, the trade dealings that have been taking place in Africa, wherein, you know, the African nations are being debt trapped. And as much as I do not like to use the word debt trap, it is what it is being going on. Like, for example, many nations have been suffering. It's not just one or two nations. It's like almost 1/3 or 1/4 of Africa at this point of time. So I think as much as we have our own beliefs, we also need to face the reality. And given that, I believe that at least for the time being, it's better that if we do want to establish a sort of polarity, it should be in the form of manufacturing that goes on. It should be in the form of the technological advancements that goes on. And given that ASEAN as a group of nations is now rising towards the next manufacturing hub of Asia, we also have countries such as South Korea, we have countries such as Japan, we have countries like Taiwan. Again, calling Taiwan a country is a controversy in itself, which I do not want to get into, but we have Taiwan as well, we have India. So why not we create a grouping of these nations who more or less embrace democracy in itself, who more or less embrace the fact that we need to have a transparent world. We need to have a world which is driven by the values of justice, good conscience at its forefront, and also economic freedom. So I think a shift in the supply chain, global supply chains, if that could be more advocated, if that could be worked upon, a world where technological advancements is centered around these nations, then I think we can at least balance out the sort of rise that China is bringing. It's not about establishing another hegemony, but I think somewhat to somehow to stabilize the current imbalance. I think that's what we need to at least look at going forward.
Yes, and provided that this technological advancement, the knowledge concerning technological advancement is also shared.
Absolutely.
That's something very important, right? Yeah. Quickly, Gauri, because we are almost overshot the time.
Yeah, I'll just take a minute, that's all. So like, I totally agree with what Anand was just saying. The fact that China's rise is seen in such a negative notion in the world is because of the kind of values that they, I'm not talking about the people of China as such, but of course, that they stand for is because the kind of, we often hear about issues of labor laws and such things coming out of there, and how a lot of companies want to shift bases from China, given this whole scenario of people actually complaining about their compliance to labor laws and human rights and such issues as well. So given that, I think that is that being one thing, and also how the majority of the world countries are democracies, and China not being one, that difference is sort of creating this place where the growth of China is seen in a negative notion, and the world wants to counter it so that there is no imbalance, and then there is no one power that is trying to dictate terms to everyone, is what I see from this kind of place. Thank you.
Yeah, that's again a very fair assessment in that sense, because I'll be a little provocative here in the sense that if you actually see the allegations that China faces when it comes to, human rights issue or whatever. And again, China has also very strong grounds on, it says that you cannot speak on. They literally believe in the principle of sovereignty, in the sense that any sort of voice that's raised against whatever happens within China is seen in that sense interference by. And there are domestic problems. If you see, it's not just China that has human rights issues, but I think across Asia, if you see in other countries, in India as well, we have these kind of issues, and we've seen these issues surfacing here and now very prominent. So we also have domestic problems, right? Despite, and the very value that we also believe in democracy today, we know for that matter, is under threat, right? With the existing political developments that we see in the country for that matter. So I think each country has its own fair share of domestic problems, and these domestic problems also mirror foreign policy, right? Foreign policy is again not something that happens in vacuum. They are, after all, in many sense, representative of the domestic issues. And similarly, it's in the West. If you see again in the EU, as I was just mentioning previously, that EU believes in the value of liberal democracy, which it also professes, across the world. Even to China, it tried, didn't work. That's a different thing. But EU itself has problems with democracy, where its own member states are moving towards more authoritarian notions, right? So there are domestic issues, and of course on the issues of domesticity, domestic problems, and how they sort of hamper EU-Asia relations is something that we will take up in another session towards the end, which basically also will wrap up. So I will not take any more time for that. I think I'll take the last question from Alisa, and then we will close. I think it's been a long day. Yeah, Alisa, with you, we'll close this session.
Okay, I just take and make it quick. Just take a quick question. Was that, as we have seen in the previous points by everyone, each country has like its own different ideology. Like, for example, the previous point also, that how countries can coordinate based on maybe even democracy for that matter. I had a doubt that even the idea of democracy to begin with is different in each country. Like, the definition of it changes in every country. So how will that bring them to cooperate? Because example, even if you take India and Pakistan, even if you take such two close neighbors, our ideas are so I think that's going to be a huge challenge.
Absolutely. I think you've also raised a very, very valid point. And that's exactly what I was also trying to make here, that even if you're talking about values of human rights, values of democracy, just the idea of democracy differs. What democracy means to us in India, and what democracy, let's say, means to the European Union, or to even democracy, the very idea of liberal democracy differs in the US and the European Union. So both of them call themselves as champions of liberal democracy, right? There's a difference in the perception, in the way they actually look at the idea of liberal democracy. So that also has contributed to fair share of, let's say, problems and contestations and differences among different countries, which we see them playing out here. We see them playing right out. All right, I think it's quite some time, and I know that I could see a few more questions and responses in the chat, though we do not have the time to take them today, but we will continue to discuss and deliberate on these issues as we proceed. Of course, tomorrow morning we'll start with a panel discussion. We have two prominent scholars who will join us, who will give you an insight into how the very idea of the Indo-Pacific that we know. There's a lot of, I'm sure you're also slightly familiar with the Indo-Pacific and its very emergence of Indo-Pacific. Where did this idea come up in the first place, right? Nobody talked about the Indo-Pacific maybe 5 years or 3 years ago even. So how is that today our political discussions are all about Indo-Pacific? And again, this region has different conceptualizations. Different countries conceptualize the notion of Indo-Pacific very differently. And that's something that we will see. It's important for us to understand the various conceptualization of Indo-Pacific, because that would make sense as to when we try and look at different topical issues to understand these cooperation on the Indo-Pacific and EU-Asia context, we'll understand it better. So that's the idea with which we will start tomorrow's session. So see you all tomorrow at 12, followed by the brainstorming session. So brainstorming session, I would say, please, of course, do not miss any of the session, but specifically the brainstorming session, because that's, I think you can carry forward some of the discussions that you wish to have further with your other participants during the brainstorming discussion, where we'll leave you along with, of course, with each other to discuss and deliberate on these matters. All right. Thank you very much for the time and for the discussions that you have fueled into day one. We meet tomorrow exactly at 12. So please do log in at least 5-10 minutes before the start of the session. All right. Thank you. And please do read. Okay. It will really help you to engage better what the scholars are going to be speaking of. All right. Thank you very much. See you. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.